Shooting it raw?
Yes. Shooting it raw.
Photography to me and photos in general are memories, and they evoke feelings for me. I think ever since I can remember, one of my favorite things to do as a kid was go through photo albums and look at the photos of my ancestors, and then going through to my grandparents, my parents, their childhoods, and then my own. And I always felt like I was always that person who had to have a camera back when it was a film camera, taking pictures of everything, because that's how I felt like that's how we're preserving memories.
Kelly Florence.
Yes.
Lovely to meet you. Thank you for
Nice to
joining
meet
me
you.
on. Yeah, thanks for joining me on the podcast. I love it.
Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. Okay, this podcast is my way of meeting fellow writers, fellow creatives, fellow conservationists, inspiring women. That's my excuse to reach out and say, how do you make sense of the world? And this week, right now, so my usual way of, I have a day job and all this stuff, but what I usually do is I look into the world and I start inviting people to join me. But the backdrop of all this right now is what's going on in Ukraine. Okay, so you had kind of mentioned. I mean, I know that you probably weren't expect. I don't even know what the direction will be, but it's just a very heavy heart, right? So, do you know any Ukrainians at all? Like, do you have any connection to Ukraine or that part of the world?
Just some coworkers, some friends of friends, and my all of my relatives are in Finland, so it's close there to Russia. So I know that they're really feeling
Yeah,
tense, and yeah, my heart goes out to everyone there in the entire situation. It's just devastating.
it really is. It really is traumatic. And I know that this was not at all what you expected in setting this up, and we will dive into your work, but I would feel weird to not have at least some mention of it, just so that you know that I'm trying right now to bring people in to try to share their stories as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely, and it's so important. And I know we still have our day to day, like you said, day jobs, or trying to spend time with our families, our friends, and it's all happening at the same time, and it feels a little strange to go on with life when so many people are struggling. So I appreciate you bringing it up, because it's important to acknowledge, and hopefully we can all do what we can, whether it's donating money or
Right.
supplies or something.
Okay, well, let's dive into your first photo. It's audio, so people don't sense this, but reading between the lines is just a little bit that we're talking, and looking at your expression and the environment, the setting that you're in. It's communicating certain things. And am I the first person to ever say that you're a sensitive soul?
No, so no, that's absolutely true.
Yeah, I get the feeling. Okay. So let's go jump into the first photo. Yeah, again, I don't see the photos, so it's a surprise. So what did you send me? Okay, so it's a photograph of somebody on a dirt road where the dirt road is leading through these open gates, which were probably like a cattle pasture or something. Like the gates, it's that kind of the gate itself is metallic, so maybe it's horse or maybe it's cattle, and there's wooden fencing, and behind there's like an old wooden barn with what looks like maybe some tin or metallic roofing that's quite rusted, or so I guess copper or something. And then there's also shingle on the taller barn, I guess. Yeah, so walk us through what's the significance of this image?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I grew up. All of my ancestors are from Finland, and they immigrated to the United States and were cattle farmers. And so all sets of my great grandparents settled and had farms. And so my grandparents grew up on farms. My parents grew up and would help with the farms. And then by the time my parents grew up, they were the first to go to college. And
Mm-hmm.
I never had that farming experience, but the old broken down barns were on the properties where I would visit. And so it was just always nostalgic. And even though I never saw the farms working, it felt like
Mm.
this visceral experience to imagine and see the photos, like we're talking about photography of a day to day life, like
Mm-hmm.
waking up with the sun and working hard all day, every day.
What part of the world is that?
So I'm in northern Minnesota.
Minnesota. Okay.
Yep. So it's if you picture Lake Superior, the largest freshwater lake on the planet, it's about an hour north of there,
Okay.
where all my great grandparents settled. And apparently, and I know this from visiting there, the landscape is a lot like Finland. So they
Okay.
say a lot of immigrants from Finland settled here because
It felt
it felt
familiar.
similar.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So in this particular photograph, it's shot. There's a bit of cloud cover, but there is sun, so it's a quite high contrast, dramatic. It looks like it. Well, there's grass on the ground, but the trees don't have full on leaves. So is this spring? It's probably spring. Are you quite familiar with this particular farm? Is this like a
No, that just evokes something in me. And so here's the where the juxtaposition is I although I appreciate everything about the farming life, I also it felt like I wanted to get out and I wanted to do these creative
mm-hmm,
endeavors like writing,
right?
and I really love film and theater, and none of my family ever got to do that, and
Mm-hmm.
even if they wanted to, so it felt like a sense of being stuck.
Okay.
And so it was like, am I going to follow in the footsteps of my ancestors, which was fair, or can I accomplish my dreams? And I feel like we're
Ah,
in that generation where now we are able to pursue these creative endeavors where previous generations may not have been able to.
so did you go away for university? Did you go away for school or?
Yeah, yeah. So I went and I actually majored in theater, and
Oh,
then I got my master's in communicating arts.
oh
And
wow.
so it was it was that feeling of I get this opportunity to do this,
Right,
and so I'm thankful every day.
right. So I think it's not an uncommon theme of the person who kind of grows up in a very rural space, who dreams of self-fulfillment by going to the big city and pursuing their creative path or technical path or whatever path. It's the idea of I have to get away from the farm, right? So how real was that feeling inside you?
Yeah, absolutely 100% real. I thought about it every day,
Oh wow.
and I don't know why, but it felt like I felt guilty almost for being able to do things that maybe other people, previous generations weren't allowed to or able to. And so
Mm,
I felt like, is this selfish because I'm having fun
right,
and doing something creative instead of working with my hands and cooking all day like my
right,
great grandmothers did.
right,
So I still I still cook and clean and all that, but it's yeah, it was definitely that feeling of, is this selfish? And
right.
so the community I grew up in, I graduated in a class of 30
Okay.
total,
Oh
for
wow.
my senior class, K through 12 school, and it was a really small, tight knit community,
Yeah.
and loved it there, but also longed for more.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so my first degree was in creative writing, and I was full on science, physics, chemistry, that kind of stuff. But then I had my first course, which was in the short story. And the professor, well, it was a college, so the sort of the professor who came in, he taught theater at the university, and he read a story, and I don't know if there's a connection, but from Anton Chekhov, Russian doctor who was a gifted, super gifted writer, and he read this story called Heartache or something. To whom shall I tell my sorrow? And when he was done reading, people were actually crying in the classroom. And then when that feeling was evoked, I was like, okay, hold on. So I dropped out of sciences and I went into creative arts. And so you said you went into theater and you're also into writing. Well, why don't you talk about that whole idea of the room of your own, and also just diving into that sea of creativity to kind of find yourself, but also communicate to others.
Yeah. So ever since I was little, I was really shy. And I guess I still am shy to a point, but I learned through theater and speech, which it's a competitive thing in Minnesota. Anyway, I learned that I had a voice. And
Mm-hmm.
so I was writing speeches and then performing in plays. And it was a way to show myself outside of myself. And it felt less vulnerable to
Mm-hmm.
be in a performing
Sure.
space. And then I learned I loved researching and I loved writing and just kept pursuing that. And at the same time, my dad was a science teacher and my mom was a nurse, and I
Mm.
felt like, well, should I be doing
Right.
one of these other paths? Because it's not necessarily practical to major in theater,
Right.
but I loved it and I was happy, and I still am super thankful that I did that. And so it was this outlet that allowed me to become, I think, the best version of myself.
Right. Okay, well, now, so I don't know what other, I don't know how explicitly you're going to go into. Okay, so the reason why I met you was because you're an author.
Yes.
So is it that you've recently completed a book and you want to promote it, or is it that you have a series of books? Like, where are you in your career journey,
Yeah.
whatever evolution as a writer?
So currently working on my sixth book with
Oh
my
wow!
co-author. Our fifth book is coming out in the fall,
Oh
and
wow!
so our the other photos that we'll get to, I won't spoil anything, but it'll definitely explain what I write about and why I write about it.
Okay, 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 okay. Fantastic. Okay, well, do you want to use that as the segue to the next photo?
I would say so. Yes.
And you're great. You're natural. I also wait before we do that. I want to say a couple of things. I immediately get a sense of your aesthetic expression, and your nails are full on perfect. I love the cut.
Thank
So,
you.
so people can understand. Each finger is a different color. Yeah,
Yes.
I love it.
And if the reason they're painted this way, one of my favorite movies that came out in 2020 was a movie called Promising Young Woman, and she paints her nails like this
Ah,
in the movie, and I just have to keep doing it because
I
I get
love
so
it.
many compliments. How can I
Yeah,
go back?
yeah. No, I love it. I love it. Okay, let's go to the next photo. Okay. Um, okay. I love that I don't know what I'm going to see. Oh, it's like it's
Yes.
like unpackaging a present. Okay, so
Yes.
it's a photo. Now you made this photo, or is this kind of
No, I found it.
it's a fantastic image. So it's a photo of three jack o' lanterns with different expressions. One is kind of like shocked, kind of scared. One of them is a goofy grin, and one of no, then another one's totally goofy grin. They're not humongous pumpkins, but the color of the photographs are there's on the road. There's like yellowing leaves, and the background is all blurry. And yeah, so please walk us through this.
So I know you said I'm a sensitive soul, and I am, but what I write about is scary things, about
Okay.
horror movies.
Oh,
And my favorite holiday when I was very young was Halloween because I loved seeing the monsters come to life in these
right,
costumes. And it was
right.
like a safe way to feel a little scared. And I remember I was fairly young, and I remember saying to my dad, Christmas is real, Easter is real, all these holidays are real. Why can't Halloween be real? Like, why can't zombies come out of the ground on Halloween? And my dad's like, would you really want that? But I loved scary things. And so then from that jumping off point, my dad started introducing me to classic horror films and then newer horror films. And something that, inside me sparked. And I had to read everything that was scary, watch every scary movie. My first grade teacher told us about the legend of Bigfoot, and a
Mm,
lot of my other classmates were scared. And I was like, when I get home today, I'm going out to the woods. I'm going to try to
Oh,
find him. So it was,
nice.
it's just always it's that thing. So I love Halloween. I love fall. I love all things spooky.
There's this thing about the horror film and the horror movie that you get the rush of adrenaline, you get that sort of that safe way of being terrified or being scared, and then but would you say that as you got away from your teenage years and your 20s, I guess, that ability to get the thrill has diminished, or has it always been and still is at that sort of level?
I would say it's still at that level, and it's a matter of the things that scare me now versus then.
Oh,
And the things that are scarier to me now, our last book that came out in October was about serial killers and
okay.
the movies that and TV shows that have been based on them. And that's
Oh,
the thing; that's real, and like it's when the horror movies are based on truth. Truth can be scarier than fiction, and that's what we found in our research. And so, yeah, the things that scare me maybe have shifted, but it's still as I still get that rush of adrenaline.
like mortgage payments.
Yeah.
Different kind of terror. Different kind of terror. So, why don't you promote one of your previous book titles?
Sure. So my co-author and I started a podcast called Horror Rewind, where we were looking at the horror movies from our childhood and seeing if they lived up to a sort of a modern lens. Were they as good as we remembered them, or was it all nostalgia? And what we found is that every time we talked about a horror movie, we were gravitating to the truth and the science behind what that movie was based on initially. And so that led to our first book, The Science of Monsters.
Huh.
So we looked at different types of monster movies and the real science, psychology, uh, everything, the culture and legends that these movies were based on. And we got to interview all different sorts of experts, filmmakers, scientists, law enforcement, and and just realizing everything that goes into one of these fictional plots, but how much is based on truth.
Right. Right. That's fascinating. That's yeah. That is interesting. And also, given the fact that you said your I think it was your dad who taught science, or your
Yes,
mom who
yep.
taught. Yeah. So that's also interesting. Okay. So have you thought or talked about or kind of gone into maybe some of the motivations of why, because there's something of the forbidden about or taboo of going into this kind of territory. So is it about pushing boundaries, or is it just about giving an audience a sort of the heightened thrill?
Yeah, something I've learned through this process and just being a horror fan in general is a lot of people push back like why do you like scary movies, why do you like horror movies, they're terrible or terrifying. And some people even think, well, you must be a bad person if you like this creepy stuff. But what I've come to understand is that a lot of horror fans, and I think with me especially, it's empathy building. Like when you watch a horror movie or read a horror novel, you're empathizing with the characters and you're feeling with them the things that they're
Yep.
going through. And
Yep.
in a sense, and not that, the creature from the Black Lagoon is going to get me if I go swimming tomorrow, but you put yourself in that position. It's like, okay, what would I do in this situation? And so you learn about all different sorts of people and situations. And, I think you become a better person for it because you're empathy building.
Okay. Yeah. So we have these cells in our brain, these neurons. I mean, maybe you would be able to give me the science lesson on this one, but we have these mirror neurons that, if we see something, they will kind of respond as if it's in our own body or in our, in our own experience. So
Right.
and that is very much empathy. You're right.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm thinking about like, and this is totally going to date me because I haven't seen any recent horror movies, but like the stuff that I grew up on, Nightmare on Elm Street and that kind of stuff. I'm trying to think of, because I've kind of I've lost the ability to watch those movies again. Like I've just kind of
Okay.
stopped watching them. And so, what have you learned in terms of staying within the genre and just doing it, like you essentially building a mastery in this sort of area?
Yeah. So something that I think has actually helped. People think, "Oh, you're talking about science, so are you ruining the movie for us because you're giving all the secrets away?" Actually, what I think is it's revealing more. And so, speaking of Nightmare on Elm Street, this might make you want to go back and rewatch it because Wes Craven was inspired by the story that he heard about Hmong immigrants in the 80s. They were fleeing Laos after the Vietnam War,
Okay.
and a large number of them were dying in their sleep. And they believed it was because of this sleep demon from their culture called the dacha.
Okay.
And it's sort of like sleep paralysis. They would feel this pressing demon on their chest,
Oh
and
wow.
they were literally a large number of them were dying in their sleep.
Huh.
And so they thought, because of cultural beliefs, that they were being punished for leaving their homeland. But medical experts concluded that it was actually a combination of two things: sudden, unexplained nocturnal death syndrome and cardiac arrhythmia that
Right.
was really specific to this group of people from that region of the planet. And
Wow.
so Wes Craven read this and he's like, wait, what if there was this guy, this demon who would come and murder you in your dreams, in your sleep? And
Wow. Wow.
so
Wow.
it's based on this really interesting and horrific story, of people fleeing. And so it gave me a new appreciation for that entire franchise,
Yeah.
because it was based on something so real.
Uh-huh. Well, yeah, well, clearly from your own writing, even if it is a nonfiction sort of dive into it. I mean, for example, I've done scientific writing, and in a way, obviously in a scientific paper, you're an invisible kind of author, but your persona or your ego is there somewhat.
Right.
I love that we're talking about writing. That's great. Somebody who's listening who wants inspiration to write, would you have a nugget of truth for them that you could tell them now?
Yeah, I would say write, write what you want to write what you're passionate about, and then it might lead you down a rabbit hole or a path that you're not expecting to go down. Like
Hmm.
I never dreamed that I'd be writing about the science of horror movies, yet here I am, and it's the most fascinating, most fun
Mm.
research I've ever done. And
Oh
so
wow.
I would say, follow the path where it takes you, and don't necessarily say, well, I would never do that, because you just don't know what you're going to come up with.
Yeah. So the person I had on the podcast 2 episodes ago wrote a book called The Big Power of Tiny Connections. And her sort of thesis was that when you meet somebody, it's like you're kind of unpacking a present to say, well, who are you and what can I get? Or you just kind of, you're discovering something. And that's resonating in my head. And then we start talking, and I would have never ever dreamed that we'd be talking about Nightmare on Elm Street and that you would be able to school me on where that came from and the backdrop of these people just having this sudden death syndrome.
Yeah.
Uh, and another person that I had on the podcast was a woman who talked about her parents fleeing from Vietnam as refugees, and this idea of intergenerational trauma,
Yes.
right? So we're having this discussion about Nightmare on Elm Street, Laos, discovering new people. There's the war in Ukraine, and it's like a big soup. I'm just like, and while we're talking, I've
Yes.
got these three pumpkins staring at me.
Yeah. I know the pumpkins seem very trivial at this point, but yes, and you would never believe, those, like you were just talking about intergenerational trauma. We wrote about that in one of our books, in regards to the Halloween franchise. So speaking of
Okay.
Halloween and the iconic pumpkin.
Yeah.
Laurie Strode, she's the final girl and she survives Halloween, but in the latest iterations of those films, we see what intergenerational trauma has done, how she has raised her daughter and granddaughter to be wired differently because of that trauma that she suffered, and now they have been too. If you
Oh,
haven't seen
wow.
those films,
Oh,
Michael
wow.
Myers is still pursuing.
Sure. Kelly, I'm floored. I'm like, this is great. This is really great. Okay. Okay, let's promote one more book title.
Sure. Well, if you go, I don't know if this is time, but if you go to the third photo, that is actually going to segue into the next book.
Beautiful! And you just opened that door. Thank you. It's okay, so it's a black and white shot. Unbelievably realistic. I mean, the photograph, the lighting is really, it's black and white. It's a delicious black and white where you kind of really see some gorgeous tone and texture. It looks like, at first I thought it was a bobblehead, but then I
Oh,
realized,
okay.
no, it's a proper kind of sculpture of like Frankenstein, the sort of the 1950s, I'm assuming, I may have been completely wrong, but cinematic Frankenstein, quite faithful to a proper, I mean, it looks quite realistic.
Yeah.
Even the sort of the jacket. Why would Frankenstein be wearing a sports jacket that's kind of buttoned up? But it looks quite real and so first of all, how large is the sculpture?
I would say it's like life size, like a bust. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so do tell.
So one of my first horror movies that I was introduced to was Frankenstein.
Yep.
And then as we were researching, well, we wrote about it in our first book, but as we were researching for our second book, which is The Science of Women in Horror, we were exploring
Oh,
just the
wow.
genre of horror and how women have been involved. And
Yeah.
what we discovered is that Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Mary Shelley, she was 19 years old when she wrote that.
Yep.
And she basically invented the modern horror genre. And so
Mm-hmm.
the cover of our book is actually The Bride of Frankenstein, which
Okay.
I just love. I love that classic monster movie
Oh,
look.
right.
And
With the hair and the makeup and
yes,
yeah.
and that book, the Science of Women in Horror, we were actually nominated for a Bram Stoker Award for Superior
Oh.
Achievement in Nonfiction when it
Oh,
came out in
wow.
2020. So we're very proud, and we really just poured our hearts and souls into that book, and we got to interview so many amazing women,
Oh, wow.
and just to see how women have been involved in horror the entire time, even though maybe there's a misconception, or there was that horror's just for the boys, or if you're a girl you can't
Right.
possibly like horror movies.
Right. Well, okay. Here we have this dive that are all of your books co-authored?
Yes. Yep.
So,
All of the science series is co-authored with and it's with my best friend, and her name is Meg Hafdahl.
okay. Props to Meg. Props to Meg. Uh,
Yes.
I have some experience in putting books together. And so in terms of these joint collaborations, like how long would you take to put together the manuscript?
Yeah, we write fairly fast, and so we've been writing one book every 6 months.
Oh, wow.
Because our first book came out in 2019. We had two books come out in 2020. One just came out this fall, and one's coming out next fall. And like I said, we're working on our sixth one right now. So
Amazing.
yeah, it's been a wonderful process, and we didn't know we had written plays together before,
Okay.
and that's such a different process than writing nonfiction together. But it's been wonderful, and it works out well, and we've been best friends for almost 22 years now.
Oh,
So it's it's awesome that to get to do something you love with your best friend.
yeah. Well, and clearly you both have a groove because it is production and it
Yeah,
is about putting, and just kind of, it's not, I don't want to use the phrase churning it out, but it is the process of constructing these things. And of course, the more you do it together, the more you kind of fall into the rhythm, I guess.
Yes.
So why don't you talk about what is the typical writing day, if there is such a thing, for you guys?
Yeah. So when we started off with our first book, we very clearly wanted to make sure that we each had a hand in every chapter. And so we were writing every chapter together, step by step, saying, I'm going to research this, you research that, and we're going to come together and
Oh,
put it
wow.
together.
Okay.
As we got used to the process, even through that first book, we realized, okay, we have such a similar voice. And as we go through and edit it together, we can always change things up. But then we
Yeah.
started splitting up the work and splitting up chapters, and we found that it was even faster, of course,
Yeah.
that way if we just come together after it's written. And so we split up chapters based on, I feel really passionate about this movie, I want to write about it, or hey, I know somebody that we can interview, so I'll take the lead on this chapter. And it's worked out really well. And yeah, I don't know how other collaborators work, if it's more like pulling teeth, but we've been very happy and successful with how we do it.
Well, I think what it is like, I don't know if I guess for some people it would be a kind of, it depends on the egos, right? And
Yeah, that's true.
it sounds to me that you're friends first, and you're like truly collaborating, and you've figured out that you can actually have a really good rhythm together. So can you name a time or a moment where you both discovered something truly surprising, where you kind of looked at each other and said, okay, this is big, this is new, this is really unexpected?
I was just thinking it's very random, but we were writing about this movie called The Babadook. And this isn't really a spoiler because it happens right away in the beginning of the movie. The character, the woman's husband, dies in a car accident.
Mm-hmm.
And we write about the themes of, the movie and what happens in it. But at that moment, we were researching, also it ties into what we were talking about. Madame Curie and her husband died in a
Yeah,
carriage accident.
yeah.
And it was like, wait a minute, why this is paralleling exactly what we're talking about. And they don't mention that at all in the movie, but
Oh,
just through research, it was like a lightning bolt.
yeah.
It's like, wow, everything is related.
Well, it's amazing how some themes do cycle, but do you think they're related only because you're making the connections post hoc, like after the fact, saying, oh, well, I can connect this to that. Like, for example, right now, upon reflection, because as we're speaking, I'm looking at this bust, right? So how large is this bust? You said it's roughly life size.
Yeah.
Where does it live?
I'm not exactly sure. I assume it's a museum of some type, but
Okay.
yeah, everything I just I've got a framed copy of that,
Hmm.
just to look at and inspire me.
Right. So there's this interesting thing about having this notion of traditional barriers to either by I don't know, your sex or gender. Like, oh, horror isn't really a female thing. Well, says who? Like, why not? And in the
Right.
same way that that physics wasn't or radiology wasn't a female thing, and you happen to cite Marie Curie. So it's like, okay, there's an interesting parallel there as well.
Yeah, definitely. And we really talk a lot about the not only the women who were pioneers in the horror genre, but also in the sciences, and we make sure to interview, female identifying creatives and scientists, just to, uplift those voices and make people realize these aren't, exclusively, male dominated fields, or maybe
Hmm.
they previously have been, but it's definitely, the tide is shifting.
Right. Okay. Do you also teach? You sound like
I
you
do.
teach.
I do.
Okay.
I teach communication at Lake Superior College. It's part of the Minnesota State University system.
Okay. So would you, for example, looking at your at students today and trying to compare them to what, say, your class was like when you were in the class, how have perceptions, or how have assumptions, or how have the biases shifted?
Yeah, I feel like, well, as I mentioned, I was especially shy, but I feel like the female identifying students speak up more than maybe we did in my generation when I graduated, and feel like they have a voice in the classroom, or, when they're writing their essays or papers, or discussing points. I feel like that has shifted, and maybe that's my own singular sort of experience, but I feel like that's one major thing. And then also just like everything is so much more inclusive and diverse in the classroom, and the video examples that we use, and the teaching examples. And so it feels like there's a place at the table for everyone.
Okay. So an engineer, I worked for a little while in an engineering consulting firm, and a lot of the engineers had a real classic way of seeing the world. That the world is kind of, you face problems and challenges that you can deconstruct, and you can create solutions, and engineers just think in a particular way. So how would you explain to somebody who has zero interest in either the scientific merit, or in the cultural merit, or the inherent merit of something that seems utterly fantastic? Horror films are in many cases, like, okay, there is some horror which is very close to real life, but many horror films are completely magical thinking, right? So
Right.
how do you kind of open the door to somebody who would just look at you with confused eyes, to kind of say, well, look again, it's more fascinating than you think?
Yeah. So we've had many readers reach out to us who were not traditional horror fans, and not into scary things at all, who have come to tell us, hey, somebody recommended this book and I was skeptical, but it actually opened my eyes to this genre or these concepts. And for some of them, it made them go out and seek out some of these movies to watch, and they were able to watch them through this lens where
Yeah.
it made it less scary for them, where they may not be a traditional horror fan.
Yeah.
And this, that reminded me, you were talking about engineering. I taught a semester where I had an entire classroom of engineering majors, and another classroom was entirely full of fine arts majors, and then the rest were mixed. And I assumed, based on my own stereotype, well, the engineering students, it was a public speaking class, well, they're not going to do great because they're not maybe used to public speaking, and the fine
Right.
arts students, they're going to be the best class I've ever had. And it was actually the opposite. The engineering students, they knew that they were maybe had to overcome this hurdle, and they took it seriously. They were
Yeah.
the best class I've ever had. Whereas the fine arts students figured, this is an easy A, and hardly tried. And it was the worst. It was the worst
Okay.
class I ever had. So, kind of like our books. Well, just because you assume something or you think something, it doesn't make it true.
Right.
And so you have to follow through and, see what happens.
Yeah. Kelly, I love it. Now, okay, so I kind of think you hinted at it, and I'm sorry if I didn't catch on. I didn't lock onto it. You've also written fiction.
Right. And nothing published yet, but
Okay.
my best friend and I, we write screenplays together.
Oh.
So we've got some short films, some TV scripts, and some features. And we're shopping things with our agent right now, which is exciting. But so
Oh,
yes,
nice.
and definitely in the horror genre.
Okay. Do you have a pandemic film in the works?
We don't. we're
Just like, who wants to talk
avoiding the
about that?
subject. Yeah, we wrote about it in our third book, The Science of Stephen King, because of course his
Yeah.
famous novel, The Stand, was based
Yeah.
on a pandemic, and that book, we were literally writing that chapter when we went into lockdown in March 2 years ago, and so it felt very eerie, and we didn't know sort of what would happen, but here we are 2 years later.
Yeah. Amazing. Shall we move on to the fourth photo?
That'd be great.
This is for me. I love talking shop about writing, and I'm loving this. I'm loving this because I don't write horror. I write mostly nonfiction about well, whatever it is that I write about. But I love hearing how you think. Great.
Awesome.
Okay, so here's his photo is two friends sitting together on a suede sofa. Behind, like let's talk about the background. Behind is what is like a exposed brick that's been painted over in white. It's a black and white shot. The image is a little bit overexposed, or it's quite high contrast. So
Yes.
wearing black dresses, like the black little, what's it called? What's the phrase again? The
A little black dress. Yeah.
little black dress. You're both wearing little black dresses. I think, yeah, the expression is hands together, sitting next to each other, laughing. So warm. What is this image?
Yeah. This is me and my best friend, Meg. And this was our first photo shoot before our first book came out. And I just feel like it says everything about our friendship and us. And we just have a genuine love for each other and each other's
Yeah.
families. And we've been through so much together. So
Wow.
here's a side note. We met because my husband was in intensive care in the hospital and was dying. He was
Oh.
only 24. Meg
What?
was working at the hospital gift shop, and every day I would have to go down when they were doing procedures on him, and I would waste some time looking around the gift shop. We connected. He ended up passing away that summer, but
Oh,
Meg and
wow.
I formed this bond, and we've been best friends ever since. And so that tragedy, the
Okay.
unspeakable, which I never imagined, like I didn't know where my life would go. I came out stronger through that, and she's been in my life ever since, and we've got all this history together, and like I said, now
Wow.
we're writing our sixth book together. So I think my message to anyone listening would be, just you just never know where life is going to bring you. So
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
keep going.
Absolutely. That just hit me like a brick to the side of the head. Okay.
I'm so
So
sorry. It's a lot, but
what? Sorry, you're not Canadian. I'm Canadian. You don't say sorry. Maybe it's the water from Lake Superior. I have no idea.
yes,
Uh,
yes, we're Canada adjacent. So
yeah. Okay. So okay. So as you're explaining this to me, I'm looking at this photo of what is just clearly warmth, shared kindness between two souls, right? Like two people who are just connected. And of course, I'm projecting into it, and it's sort of filtered through what you're telling me about the story, which is super powerful. You both have tattoos on your arms. Now,
yes.
are they connected, these tattoos, or no?
So, at the time, they're both horror tattoos. She's got Lydia from Beetlejuice, and I've got Bruce Campbell from Evil Dead.
Okay.
But now on my right arm and her left arm, we each have one of the Shining twins, the Grady
Okay.
girls. And so
Right.
when we stand next to each other, they hold hands, just like the girls hold hands.
Ah, fucking nutter. You're a fucking nutter. I love it. It's actually unbelievably tender and sweet and powerful because there's this author. I think he's Chinese. I think his name is Hajin. I think he wrote about like essentially like we're all like piano strings that just kind of move around the world, and we're all just kind of vibrating at our own note or pitch or key or whatever. And every once in a while, we come close to another person who's vibrating at roughly the same note, and then we start resonating, and that builds, right? And so, in a sense, when I see the both of you sitting like that, and it's a photo shoot, and the photographer must have said something to make you giggle and laugh, but I feel this sort of resonance of these two spirits sitting together, who have kind of found themselves in this weird kind of and that's life. Like we don't know how we're going to cross paths. So you just fell into this pace or into these roles as co-authors. Is there an analogy of that in other friendships that somebody else can hear and maybe explore? Or how would you communicate the essence of what's in this image to somebody else to kind of reflect on their own lives and their own friendship.
I've had friends all my life, but meeting Meg, it was like meeting my platonic soulmate because we shared so many things in common and also just totally get each other and support each other at the same time can give that tough love talk if we need to, but it's finding that friend who believes in you unconditionally and will support you and be with you every step of the way, no matter what. And so being able to not only have that friendship on just the day-to-day level, but be able to be creative partners, that's just brought this other level of understanding. And, we've gone through all of this together. So every step, it's the highs, the lows, the waiting to hear back, the all everything is together. So that's been we've been so thankful for that because to take this journey on your own is a lot, but to do it with your best friend, it just feels
it's amazing.
Yeah.
Wow, very special. And the whole thing about being an author, for those who are practicing writers who tend to do it by themselves, it's very lonely, right? And
Yes,
actually, if you're doing academia, somebody doing their PhD, it's fighting anxiety and depression while you're doing your PhD is quite common, because you are by yourself, and there is
right.
But what's interesting about the work that you described about your books is that there's a lot of research and there's a lot of intellectual. It's not because creatively you're essentially synthesizing a story, and you're still telling a kind of story, I guess, through a nonfiction book, but you're researching it together and you're exploring it together. So how would you describe? I'm just assuming that you both have slightly different but complementary personalities.
We do, yeah. So even though we have a lot in common, I'm more organized than Meg, and she'll be the first one to say that. So I'm not throwing her under the bus.
Okay.
I tend to do things a little faster than she does. She's more thoughtful, and I'm more spontaneous. I am more of a morning person. She won't talk until she's had her first cup of coffee.
Okay.
Things like that, and it balances each other out. Yet at the same time, she has those traits that like I said, I'm a little more shy, and she is more assertive, and so I think that's why we work so well together too. Is that we're not carbon copies of each other. And she was a literature major, and I was a theater major, and so we have, we've each got our strengths in the areas that we studied as well.
And you've written screenplays together, you said?
Yes. Yep.
Okay, so are you bound by type or genre in terms of nonfiction versus screenplay? So somebody's listening who wants to put together a screenplay, like how would you describe the biggest differences between those two ways of writing?
I guess just format mainly, because screenwriting is its own monster, so to speak, and it's learning what is typical and how to format things. And then of course I think a lot of writers who write fiction, whether it be screenplay or novels, dialogue is I think a challenge for a lot of people, whereas when we're interviewing people for nonfiction, it's formulating questions instead of dialogue.
Yeah. Is that where your theater comes in more strongly because you've had more focus on that, or are you both kind of equal producers in both sense?
I haven't ever actually thought about that, but now that you bring it up, it does make sense because Meg writes novels, writes fiction, and so she definitely writes a certain way, and then I guess I am used to the spoken out loud stuff, like in a screenplay, whereas in a novel you're not, unless you're adapting it. So yes, this is an aha moment for me, so thank you.
I'll send you my bill at the end of our conversation.
Okay, great.
You're welcome. Kelly, let's create another aha moment then, because how do we open the door for somebody, like maybe pull something from one of your books, in terms of what other surprising insight about horror, which, I have friends who are, is Shirley Jackson,
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Sorry. See that just I'm just showing what a doofus I am. But so really into that genre and really into the whole. They would love to talk to you. But let's just say from how do you bring an outsider? Like, is there more that you can say to sort of welcome an outsider into this world? Because already what you said about explaining the background of Friday the 13th makes me want to go like, okay, I'll check that out again. But what other
Yeah.
thing can we talk about?
Well, something, our next book that's coming out in October, you can pre order now. It's The Science of Witchcraft. And we
Yes.
talk about, witches portrayed in movies and TV shows. And something, every time we research something, it brings you down a path you didn't expect. I was
Okay.
researching Sleepy Hollow, and we talk about plants coming to life and plants used as medicine. And so we were able to interview an indigenous ethnobotanist, and
Ah.
she taught us about all the ways that the indigenous people have used plants for centuries, and how what we can learn about their medicinal properties or healing properties, and that all these things that we feel like it's, well, that sounds a little woo woo, or that sounds like fiction because it's in this horror movie. It's based on real things that are surrounding us right now as I look out the window into the forest. So
Yeah.
it's, I think, I think, open your mind, be open minded, and take a chance. And you might learn something, and it
Hmm.
might lead you down your own path of research and knowledge.
Okay. Okay. I'm going to ask one more question, and that is that through your experience, like you inhabit your own body and you inhabit your own perception of the world and how the world responds to you. So, therefore, being female, being a woman, you can't escape the fact that both on the sort of the hardships and the challenges and the sort of the barriers that you had to sort of push through, you become quite aware that wait a second, that was a barrier because I'm female, but you were able to cross and push through that. So, talking about witches, if anything, what can you say about this notion of the witch and the female as a source of power for an individual girl or young woman who's listening to this, as a kind of saying, oh, wait a second, it's not actually, it's just as it's been portrayed as being purely negative, it is also an empowered identity or character.
Right. Yeah, definitely. Through our research, and as it's been portrayed in many horror movies, anytime a woman or a person, it was seen as an other, because they were women were asserting their power, or showing interest in sex, or showing non-interest in doing what the patriarchy wanted, then she was labeled a witch because something must be wrong with her,
Yeah.
or she must be hysterical, as we talked about in a couple of our other books. And so realizing that strength can come from feeling powerful, and that's okay. And it's not, it's, I think sometimes, even as young girls, even in my generation, we were taught to, well, be humble, don't brag, don't show that you're proud, don't assert yourself in these situations. It's better to stay quiet. Learning that it's okay. You should stand up for yourself. You should be proud of your accomplishments. And yeah, don't let people tell you who you are. Don't let them define you. You can define yourself.
What a beautiful way to end this conversation. Kelly, thank you so much. This is great.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So once again, like, just tell people where they can find out more about you.
Yeah, so anywhere that books are sold, our books are sold: The Science of Monsters, The Science of Women in Horror, The Science of Stephen King, The Science of Serial Killers, and now The Science of Witchcraft. My website is kellyflorence.com, and I'm on all the social medias. And then our podcast is Horror Rewind, and you can find that at horrorrewind.com.
Beautiful. Although any other podcast other than mine, other than Shooting It Raw, must die. No, I'm just joking.
You're
Of
going to
course not.
bleep it out, right?
Of
It's like I'm
course,
swearing.
no, I won't. Of course
I'm
not.
just kidding.
It's Shooting It Raw. It's perfect. Ah, Kelly, thank you. You rock. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Shooting it raw?
Yes. Shooting.